Gambling gave me an escape. Each £1,000 was a spin on roulette.
Gambling is a hidden addiction.
The ripple effect of gambling harm is just felt far and wide.
Prevention is absolutely crucial.
I'd rather the relationship ended than you get anywhere near my gambling.
On the surface, it can look like everybody's having this excellent time, experiencing all the highs, lots of wins. In reality, for those that are experiencing a level of gambling harms, it's complete opposite.
Joined the army at 17, had a very successful 23 years in the military, which had a bit of a drop in my end of my career due to a poor air judgment, which was related to gambling.
I joined the Navy in May 98. It's one thing I reflect a lot on to this day, and it's how it normalised my gambling for me.
I joined the Royal Navy as a teenager, as a hydrographic surveyor. I joined my first ship, HMS Scott, out in Madeira. It was already on deployment. We used to visit ports around the world, which were deemed not necessarily safe to socialise in city centres. And we had the exclusivity of these holiday resorts with the leisure facilities, the gym facilities, the nice food that we've gone without for so long, and casinos.
My name is Ian Whiteside. I am the Early Intervention and Education Programme Manager here at Beacon Counselling Trust. I'm also the operational lead of the Armed Forces Gambling Support Network. Research shows that there's a high prevalence of gambling within the Armed Forces community. Veterans are 10 times more at risk of gambling-related harms than the general population. Further research from the RAF Benevolent Fund has identified that between 2 and 5% of currently serving personnel are experiencing gambling-related harm. Quite a lot of the friends, colleagues that would find themselves on fruit machines at service stations or within the NAFI, it was almost like the thing to do in your spare time, to be like to fit in. If it wasn't on the sports field, you find yourself seeing a colleague seen on a fruit machine, which then would be, oh, I might try that. And then before you know it, that can move on to further gambling, whether it be the casino or football. But it was supposed to be accepted to me in the military. Not everyone was doing it, but a majority to kind of like fit in as the way of life as well.
We were given a bit of a walk around within the first few days, shown the base, shown HMS Raleigh. And in the automat, when we looked in, I would say there was close on 40 fruit machines in this automat. They were lined up around the walls, they were in the middle, and there were people queued at them almost to play the machine. There was groups of lads around each one cheering each other on. There was banter, there was camaraderie. I found my tribe, that we call it now, or my people, and the military were almost encouraging this. Otherwise, why would you have 40 fruit machines in there?
I'm Nicola. I work at the Beacon Counselling Trust as part of our treatment team and in our family support. Beacon Counselling Trust offer free support and treatment for those who've been impacted by gambling harms, either through their own gambling or as an affected other, a loved one, a family member, a friend or a colleague who's also been impacted by those harms.
Spending time in casinos in lovely foreign ports, we were made to feel very welcome. Drinking, eating, socially gambling, certainly for myself. Amongst my peers, it was just something we did. Everybody was doing it, everybody was involved. I didn't see it as an issue at all.
Gambling products such as the online slots or online casino games, you will be needing a higher hit more regularly to get that same sense of satisfaction or fulfillment. With things like online roulette or certain casino games, you're getting a hit of dopamine every 7 to 10 seconds. If you've got a smartphone, you have access to a casino in your pocket 24 hours, 7 days a week.
I was now in the forces, I had a salary, I had, new friends, people were looking at me differently. and all I wanted to do was make a withdrawal from the cash point and get straight into the automat. But we only had an hour maybe, of our free time, and I wanted that hour to be in there, and that is where I would spend my time. Weeks 4, 5 and 6 of training, it starts to ramp up, but I was still in there. I'd come back 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. I'd rather get a debriefing off my petty officer who's in charge of the division or the warrant officer than I would come off that machine and let somebody else win. So I would even risk a disciplinary rather than leave that machine if I thought I was, going to win was what was mine. And that really impacted my training. My reports went downhill. The time I was spending on my ironing and my kit and preparation, that went downhill. And this carried on right the way through. I was borrowing off Joanne so that I could gamble, telling her that we hadn't been paid yet. I'd lost my cap and I needed £50 to buy a new cap. Build up of lies and manipulation and everything else was continuous.
My ex-husband was also very heavily involved in sports, really engaged with sort of combined services. So would go away playing tennis with the RAF and the Navy internationally. Within that environment, I knew there was regular gambling activity. It was very much part and parcel of that kind of military setup, that dynamic that, welcomed amongst peers, almost, and actively encouraged. I also would hear about wins. And that is quite an important point, because whilst a person is able to talk about them, they maybe want to be generous or, have you involved in that win, whether it be buying a family member a present or utilising that money for some experience or something for themselves or others in their life. They won't talk about the losses and particularly the growth of the losses. And that is something that, as I say, became, much more regular, a lot more frequent, and then grew to a cycle where you could see an individual had been actively chasing those losses in order to try and recoup the huge amounts, not only of time, but the funding that was then actually going on that gambling activity, not just whilst away from home, but at home too.
In terms of my gambling problem or gambling through my life, I was very, very good at keeping it to myself. I never let it affect my mindset, my positivity. I'm that sort of person that's always managed to be positive, smile on my face. So in terms of my gambling, I never let it affect my work, so no one ever knew it was a problem. My wife knew there was potentially a problem and an addiction there, where I'd probably gambled occasionally more than what I could afford, but because losses are very rarely spoke about, I think we spoke about occasionally where I had lost, but generally, rule of thumb, gamblers only talk about winning.
After promotion to petty officer and going back to sea, my physical health started to deteriorate, and found out I'd been diagnosed with a condition that meant I would be medically downgraded. I was told that I would be likely that I'd be unfit to serve in the Navy at all, and I'd be presented to a medical board to decide my fate. That wait took 12 months. In that time, I was repositioned in a job in Plymouth in a naval base with my friends and family and long-term partner living over 300 miles away. I became a bit of a recluse. My mental health started to be affected. I started to drink quite heavily, started to tell lies, started to be quite deceitful, not turn up for work. As the bars and clubs were closing in the early hours, I knew that I could still get a drink in the casino. I was reintroduced to that environment, something that I was familiar with. Felt accepted. I was amongst other people that were in there same time as me, so all of a sudden I didn't feel as isolated, and I started to lose myself in gambling and alcohol, to the point where it started to become quite harmful.
one day I'm going home with thousands potentially, and she thinks everything's fixed and I've made her all these promises again, and that's the last time. We'll put that in the bank. That's me done now. I've had my big win. And to the following day or a couple of days later, where she can't even afford nappies or milk. People never ask you outright, are you gambling? They didn't want to believe I was this degenerate gambler who just loses everything.
Very easy to see if it's drink. You can smell the drink, you can see the activity in pubs. In terms of the drugs and the substances, it'll be picked up in the military in line with the compulsory drug test, but gambling, it's so much hidden addiction.
I left the service, and in that transitional phase I got a job working offshore in the North Sea, in the oil and gas industry. But with that came a substantial increase in salary and a lot more downtime. I can now see these as risk factors and contributing factors to where I ended up. The financial implications didn't really rear their head, and I maintained this habit for several years. So I resigned from that role and got a 9-to-5 working on the high street. It was in that period where the financial implications caught up with me to the point of crisis. In August 2017, suicide ideation crept in. I presented myself to A&E at crisis point, and had to accept that I was powerless over gambling and that I'd had enough. It was time to change.
We want to build on that curiosity of people to ask those questions, to look out for maybe those identifying features, particularly through mental health screening massively, which will help support that work in our intervention and prevention space. The likelihood of someone disclosing that they're experiencing gambling harms is very, very slim while they're actively serving, because it could result in either military prison time or them being thrown out the army.
Whilst I was at sea, I would cash cheques knowing or thinking, actually, there might not be enough money in there. And it happened that 2 cheques in a row bounced and were returned to the ship. The deputy logistics officer called me in and said, look, Andy, we've had these cheques returned. What is going on? Like, what's happening? And at that point, I just said, it's gambling. And he went, well, come on then, you need to get a grip on it. You know, and I just said, look, it's more than that. It's a real problem. I'm losing everything. And he said, well, you're better off keeping that to yourself. He said, because I'm telling you now, I'll have you out in a week for financial irresponsibility. Instead of the Navy then deciding, okay, I need to help this guy to lower his risk of that threat and to help me out, they just threatened with discharge. Well, that for me then, all that done was just, that made me hide.
My problem in terms of gambling really hit the wall in 2017. So I was a warrant officer class 2 at the time. The gambling was almost my breakaway of the stress away from the workplace. Before going home, one stressful week, I then lost £1,000 of my own savings, which I didn't want my wife to know, because then that then becomes an affected of, and then has a bigger problem on the family. I then borrowed money off a couple of colleagues to try and get me out of the situation. It was then thinking, right, how am I going to get that back? Didn't want my wife to know. So with that addiction in the background, looking now on reflection, made me want to ultimately kind of like double to what I had to then pay it back. It's that vicious circle and cycle. I ended up at a military corrective training centre where there was no salary for a year.
The day I found out about the gambling, to the degree of which he was experiencing levels of harm, a text message flashed up on a mobile phone. It was from a payday loan company. It showed an amount that was supposed to be leaving the account to pay this And I chose to confront him, and he immediately got defensive and tried to close it down. Accessing the account in that sort of present time, I could see thousands and, of transactions been going to betting companies. And that was my first degree of understanding that actually this was something more of an issue. Yeah. I think I remember saying, do you have a gambling addiction? And even as I said it, not even knowing if gambling addiction existed, because I'd never heard of it myself before. One of the big things that happened for our family was obviously the loss of our house through bankruptcy. The breakdown in the family unit, a breakdown in the marriage, which was equally as hard for me to process at that time, because it was a great sense of grief, and there's a huge disconnect in that whole family support of what was needed for us at that time, specifically around the gambling related harms. The opportunity for early screening and identification is so important. And I think some of my personal experience and our personal experience as a family quite highlights that there were clearly opportunities missed.
So the risk factors and the wider determinants that exist within the armed forces community show that when you leave the military, a transition from military service into civilian life can be quite a factor, a loss of sense of purpose or identity. And sometimes when people have had life challenges, things that prove difficult in their life, that could be employment issues, homelessness, issues with drugs and alcohol, then the loss of honour is a significant factor. We also know that the culture that exists within the military, the environment, sometimes can be quite permitting of gambling. So it's quite difficult maybe to avoid gambling because it's something that's quite, normal within its own culture.
And I can look back on now when the DLO sort of made that, I would call it a threat, that's what it felt like. But I can actually see potentially where he was coming from, and with gambling being very misunderstood, very hidden, from his point of view, that was probably his way of trying to help me, because what better way in most people's minds that don't understand addiction, haven't been in addiction, the best way that they feel is to almost scare you or, to frighten you into stopping doing the behaviour that you are, So I think by him saying, look, you need to stop that because otherwise you're going to end up discharged financial responsibility, was potentially his way of helping, thinking that I would take that on board and I would be able to stop, because that will be enough to make me stop. So I do. I give a lot of sort of credence to what he'd done. That probably was his way of helping. And this is why, training, education, prevention work is so needed, because if he had received, say, the training from Battling the Odds or the Bet You Can Help training, that he would have been more informed to make a better decision, to refer, to signpost me to whatever help services the Navy had available, and potentially outside services, in an attempt to get better servicemen out of me, which he potentially would have done. Looking at my recovery now and how I've taken it on, if I had had somebody who was trained and had somebody who was aware, that would have allowed them to keep me in service, and potentially could have done my 22 years instead of 13. Or, it's all hypothetical, but I think if I had had somebody who understood me that day, I would have broken down that day. I think for me to even tell anybody outside of my inner circle was massive.
Gambling-related harms can have a severe impact on a person's mental health. One of the big things we see and massively want to reduce is those that are actually experiencing a level of suicidal ideation.
Gambling for me it took away any self-belief. It took away confidence. It took away hope. And it made me not want to be around. It made me have a suicide ideation that was my only way out.
I'm telling my now wife and my family and my friends, all of which I thought I'd lose. Once I had a clear conscience, I had nice foundation blocks to start to rebuild my life and get better and get help and support. I received one-to-one CBT therapy from Beacon Counselling Trust, and that was enough sessions for me to accept and realise it was possible for me to change. I realised I needed to abstain from gambling, and I was introduced to other areas such as group therapy, which I still continue to this day.
The Battle on the Odds programme is a structured and designed programme specifically to look at the issues of gambling related harm within the armed forces community. We target services that support the armed forces community and veterans, and very much the themes of that programme are aligned to the environment the armed forces community are involved in. This project now is an absolute great opportunity to get wide awareness of the early intervention with the armed forces, whether it be serving the community, the families, or the veterans that have ultimately given up their lives before for the British Army and for the country. The unique selling point about the Battle on the Odds programme and the Armed Forces Gambling Support Network is that the practitioners that work here are themselves members of the armed forces community. They've served in the military, and we have a cohort of practitioners that have lived experience of gambling related harm. So we are able to apply and relate to this group in a really connected way.
I now work for ARA Recovery for All as education and training lead, working with the armed forces community to raise awareness around gambling harms in the armed forces. I just wish that something like the Battle on the Odds project existed when I was serving, and maybe that would have been enough for me to speak out.
The Armed Forces Gambling Support Network provides structured and accredited training as part of the Battle on the Odds programme, and that training is designed to help practitioners and those that support the military and the veterans community how to early identify gambling related harms, how to screen for the issue, and what services are available in order to put provision in place to support those individuals.
Break-even were a key dynamic into my rehabilitation. I'm a veteran myself, and I'm completely aware that 1 in 6 veterans have got mental health problems. And if we were to actually dig deeper, the underlying issue could be the gambling.
I've delivered Battle on the Odds programme to third sector organisations that support the armed forces. Not only do I have the pleasure of working with the veterans community and serving personnel, but also the reserve service and the cadet forces. I'm able to help people in their recovery after treatment in the aftercare programmes that we facilitate. Take people outdoors, getting out and about, provide peer support through lived experience, not only as a veteran, but also my gambling arms lived experience, and that's incredibly satisfying for me.
Our practitioners deliver Battle on the Odds sessions to members of the armed forces community and serving personnel. Essentially what's happening is that the session concerns itself with risk factors that relate to the military concerning gambling. It looks at the impacts, but probably, and most importantly, it will help the audience understand what services are available should they need it at the earliest opportunity.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Andy Tang. I'm the Commanding Officer of 156 Supply Regiment in Liverpool. Today, my soldiers have been learning from the Beacon Counselling Trust about the dangers of gambling addiction. As someone who has personally been affected by this, myself in my childhood, I've seen the damaging effects that gambling addiction can have on individuals, families and the wider community. So today has been really, really informative to train the soldiers about signposting the dangers and where they can go for help. And I'm certainly looking to cascade this training throughout my regiment because I really think it's added a lot of value today. So thank you to the Beacon Counselling Trust and the programme for all of their support today.
Taking part in the Battle in the Odds workshop has been really beneficial. I've got lived experience of gambling harms myself. When I found out about the education programme, I thought it would be good to invite them in, so then we'd be able to educate others within our unit as well.
It's in our gift to provide support around gambling related harms. That's what we do as part of a group of agencies. But this group means a lot to us, simply because many of us ourselves have been part of the armed forces community.
We don't only support the person witnessing the harms firsthand, we also provide support for those around them, the much larger audience of the affected other. If you've been affected by anything you've seen today, get in touch with the Armed Forces Gambling Support Network.